Hey, Arthur here. This is Brutally Honest, and today we're going to cover one of the cornerstones of this channel: language. How does language make decisions for you? Now, it should be no surprise that the way we speak defines how we think. But nowadays, this is far more important than ever. This is the second chapter of my book. I had no intention of talking about language. But I realize that given the current political climate, it is almost impossible to say anything without somebody getting outraged. So I had to include a whole section about how we think, how we talk, just to clear the water from the PC madness going around in the world. Now, you have probably been in a situation where there's a couple of people having a very heated debate about something. They hate each other, but they're both saying the same thing, just in a different tone. Like if you could remove the people and just compare the actual words they are using, then they should agree with one another. And we see this like with politicians on television all the time. When this happens, it's too late. I'm more interested in the very first steps of this problem, but I'll tell you why it happens. The solution comes from anthropology. I once thought about being an anthropologist until I realized my job prospects were not all that promising or exciting. But anthropology does teach you something very interesting. Like, why do we evolve to make tools? Here's a question: why did our ancestors made the first tools, like sticks and stones? Is it because we were intelligent enough to make them? Or we made the tools first and then we developed the intelligence to use them? It turns out the second one is the right one. We are smart not because we are smart. We're smart because we have opposable thumbs. And we can see this with chimpanzees, for example. Simply because an animal has the ability to do something, it increases IQ. We can also see this in IQ studies throughout human, well, since we have IQ studies 100 years ago, but you can regress the study through all of human civilization. We have a much higher IQ than our grandparents. The military measures IQ all the time. The military is crazy about IQ. And the military has seen that there's a steady increase in IQ, but why does that happen? The best explanation we have is the tools that we use. We use more complicated tools that require more cognitive thinking. So first we make the tool, then we develop the intelligence to use it. And the same thing happens with language. It is a common misconception that language is created to communicate with people. Communication is an accident. It's a secondary byproduct of what language truly is. If you have complicated ideas, you need higher cognitive thinking to organize those ideas. You can imagine yourself as a primitive man with no language in the wild. And the world around you keeps getting more complicated. You have more sticks, more stones, more rocks, more ideas, more concepts. Before we speak, we have to think. So you have to create a mental concept of everything around you. So the very first language was forms for people, individuals, to organize their ideas. Now, because we live in societies, even as primitive men, we're mammals and we have tribes, you decide to assign sounds to tools. and then other people start using the same tool, the same sounds for the same tool, and that's the beginning of language. That's why language keeps evolving all the time. For example, English is the most robust language in the world because it keeps imitating words and ideas from other cultures. The way it works is other cultures have words which are concepts and we imitate them. We're imitating a concept. So language is foremost a way of organizing concepts. And the secondary side effect is that we get communication. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. You see, because language is first of all a concept, and second, it's a way of expressing this concept to somebody else. This is why people are so emotional about language, and they miss the concept. They hear the words and they interpret their own concept of what that means, without really stopping to think about what the person wants to say. Here's a problem I face all over the world. I always hear people saying that Americans have no history and Americans have no culture. Now, when we hear something like that, we have an immediate emotional reaction. We say, that is obviously wrong. That is outrageously wrong, because it is. But at the same time, maybe it's not. And the problem is how language works. English and every other language, but especially in English, we are not overly specific. German is far more specific than English, but they still have this problem. If people were to say, citizens of the United States do not have a traceable heritage that visibly affects behavior on contemporary society, nor do they have a traceable traceable history of their traditions. Now, if people were to say something like that, then it would be a valid argument. That wouldn't be an argument, actually. That would be an opening statement, followed by a very interesting, very long conversation that we could all agree on, with several other arguments. But we don't do that, do we? Because in English, like every other language, we have to start with one shocking good point, concise and precise, because if we are overly specific, people get bored to death. And then you completely miss the point. So I have found out that when most of the time when people say Americans have no history and no culture, their argument is not entirely wrong if you explore the argument further into what they actually mean by it. But most of the time, people say this for the wrong reason. I have heard people from all over the world say this to me. And many times I try to address, well, what kind of arguments do you have beyond your opening statement? And in many cases, they're just as dismissive as their original intention. So that's the end of that conversation. But just because somebody has this outrageous opening statement, it doesn't mean there's no value beyond it. And nowadays it seems like every statement is an outrageous opening statement. And the problem is that language is absolute. That's why everything we say can't be outrageous from some point of view. Because we have to say things like the United States has no history. We spend years studying American history, building concepts, all kinds of concepts, and somebody comes along and says that everything is not true. So that is immediately outrageous. Now, but if you have the exact same conversation in a scientific setting, social sciences, and you try to determine where do traditions come from, what kind of traditional behavior does a society practice and where does it come from, and you start to quantify and trace down every single traditional behavior, then the conversation is no longer outrageous, it's perfectly rational. But how do we do that with language? That's always complicated. All these conversations would be much easier to have in a scientifically literate society, because then you can easily ignore whatever the person is saying at face value and simply break it down into its pieces. Because science is not about people in white lab coats mixing chemicals, it's statistics. The core of all sciences, natural sciences and natural sciences, is statistics. Finding ways to quantify things, quantify the unquantifiable, to see the unseen. In natural sciences, the unseen is something like gravity. How do you measure gravity? But in the social sciences, the unseen can be how do traditions affect people's behavior? We can see the behavior and we can see the tradition, but the relationship between them is the unseen. It's the exact same thing as natural sciences. So this is going to be the cornerstone of pretty much everything in the channel, because that's just how my brain works. It doesn't matter how outrageous a topic might be, everything is quantifiable, at least in theory, because the biggest problem we have in the natural sciences is finding information. Now, in our daily life, every time we hear something, we deconstruct the words into a concept. Now, the problem is that in our brain, we create the concept, we translate into words, and send it into the world. So when words come to us, we translate those into a concept that we can understand. So most of the time, everything that we think we hear is wrong, because we are interpreting other people's words into our own personal concepts. So, two very common mistakes happen. Number one, you hear something that you interpret as this person agrees with me, so I like it. And the opposite. This person said that I don't have any history, but I spent 12 years of my life studying the history of my own country, so of course I do have history. So you immediately clash. So in situation number one, you hear something, you agree, you think you agree, but only because you want to. The problem is that even if you agree, you're not learning anything new. So you have to break it down, go beyond the opening statement, and go down to the arguments, go down to what exactly does it mean, how would you measure it, how would you determine if that thing is true. Now, if you disagree, I'm not telling you to be open-minded or anything of the sort. If you truly disagree with someone and you just want to completely annihilate them, the best way to do it is to truly understand what they're trying to say. So go beyond the opening statement, look at their arguments, and break their arguments one by one. Ask them, how do you measure that? How can you prove, how would you hypothetically prove that such a thing is true? If I say that people in the United States have no culture, and you push the person into saying, well, what exactly do you mean by culture? How do you determine that? What is your point of comparison? Then they will eventually have to agree that they're wrong. Same thing with history, same thing with every single other topic that is covered in social media nowadays. People immediately clash to the opposite when they talk about bipartisan politics. But if you push them into explaining their point, into how they would quantify and how they would prove that they are right, you can destroy them without ever saying that you disagree. Now, in life, as in everything in this channel, whether you agree or disagree is completely irrelevant. We have to look past our misconceptions created by language, look beyond our personal concepts and break it into how and why. How can you prove that what you say is real, and what effect can it possibly have if it is real, and why did you came up with those conclusions? If you want to know more, you can get my book, or in the meantime, please subscribe, like, and wait for more. Thank you.